Greetings, family, and welcome to the H20 Network. This is Dia Nunez. I'm glad to be back on the air, especially with the guest that we have tonight, Alexander Landau. You know, my listeners have been asking me for more than 4 weeks if I'm going to respond to American life and what has been happening in reference to race and what has been going on and percolating. I have to admit that I've sort of kind of been sweeping that under the rug, but I sent an invisible beacon out into the universe. And let me tell you something. You really have to be careful what you ask for. When I met Alexander Landau, through our conversations, I knew that he was a human rights activist and an ambassador for Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. But I have to tell you, I had no idea who I was talking to until I Googled him. You have to be very careful what you ask for because it was sent to me through synchronicity, and I'm very, very glad of that. As I typed his name into the search engine, what I saw inspired me, but what I also saw was horror. And I knew that I could no longer sit by the side of the road, and I had to be a conduit for his cause and to tell his story, which, by the way, if you Google, you will know he has been on national news. He has been a victim of police brutality, and we're going to talk about his experience and where he came to be. This is probably one of the most important broadcasts, for me anyway, on the public scape to talk about race. So make sure you get your cafe con leche, your water, and you relax because we're going to dive deep. Me and Alex have decided to collaborate for 5 shows. This is first of 5 shows. Today we're going to learn who Alex Landau is, who the man is in his story. And ironically, I say it's synchronistic because, by the way, his story is on StoryCorps. It's a little mini documentary that is now being nominated for an Emmy, which is very profound because a couple of weeks before the synchronistic happening of confrontation happened, I actually saw the documentary and said to myself, wow, I would really love to meet this person and interview them. And little did I know that weeks later I would be meeting this person in person. And I knew that I had to step forward and to bring him on the H20 Network to talk about this story. I am so grateful and proud to be his friend and his colleague, and I just feel so blessed to be on air with him, to have these mini conversations, hoping that it will open up the wider scape of reality in reference to America and race. And I welcome Alexander Landau to the H20 Network. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, I'm really excited, and I have to say, this is going to be very deep and profound. As you know, I'm a shaman, so we're going to come from many different ways of reality. I think that there are many conversations for a very long time on this timeline that we have swept things under the rug. We don't like to talk about things, and we have to do this at a grassroots level. So what better way? We're going to go for many different angles because the seed of racism in this country and brutality, the seed is very, very deep. And in order to really look at this, we have to look at it from a mundane level and a very deep spiritual level, which we are going to do. And we've done that privately. But this is going to be a really interesting ride, and I'm really excited to be taking this ride with you.
Likewise.
Well, first of all, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Because as I stated, I had no idea when I first met you. I knew who you were. I knew that you were a human rights activist, but I had no idea until I Googled you. And I want people to get the depth of who Alexander is. What happened on January 15th, 2009?
So this is a component of a much larger narrative, but we'll get to that. And January was actually, what I didn't know at the time, going to be a serious point of awakening for me. I was driving home with a friend of mine here in Denver, Colorado, headed eastbound up Colfax, And this friend of mine I had met on the campus, his name is Addison. He's white. He comes from a very small town in Midland, Texas. And we were driving in the first vehicle that I had ever purchased, my first form of transportation. It was an 84 Lincoln Town Car. I paid $850 for it. It was a real kind of a clunker, unreliable form of transportation. It would die on the highway. But it was my A to B, and I was proud of it because I purchased it with my own money, and I was finally mobile for the first time. But what I didn't understand when I purchased that car was how profilable a vehicle it was. So as we're driving home, and we had only made it a couple of blocks from the area where I had picked him up at, when we had made a stop in an effort to get some cheeseburgers from a Wendy's nearby, and we never made it to that Wendy's because we were pulled over in the process. And to give you a little description about Colfax or the Capitol Hill neighborhood that we were driving through, it's a 24-hour district. They have venues, they have bars, they have street activity, they have 24-hour check cashing locations, and there's activity all the time. And where we were pulled over, just a block north on 16th and Emerson, is a totally different story. It's a gentrified part of the neighborhood, very quiet, and there's a lot of renovated Victorian homes that have been turned into law offices and treatment facilities, and there's brand new condominiums, and there was next to no traffic at the hour we were stopped. We were stopped at about 12:45 in the morning. And as we pulled under this lone street light, and the officer's vehicle pulled up behind us, and Officer Nixon comes to the side of my window and asks for goes through the usual procedure, asking for license, registration, and proof of insurance. I had realized at the time I had forgotten my wallet at the house, so I gave him, not even thinking that we were in danger, I gave him my social security number as an alternative, knowing that I did not have any arrest warrants, I did not have any outstanding traffic violations, and I had my registration and insurance that were both up to date. And I explained to this officer that I was just giving my friend a ride home, and he had stated we had made an illegal left turn coming from Colfax. And at the time, we didn't know there are many illegal left turn signs or no left turn signs on Colfax, so we didn't really question that. And he returned to his squad car and then came back. And in that period of time, I was conversing with Addison, kind of questioning the nature of the stop. Addison said he didn't see a no left turn sign. I told him I didn't see one either, but let's just see where this goes. Maybe we'll just get a traffic ticket or a warning. The next thing we know, Officer Nixon comes back to the car, and he wants us to get out of the vehicle because he says he can detect an aroma of marijuana coming from within the vehicle. And at that point, we step out of the car, and he pats us down. He doesn't find anything on me. He never places me in handcuffs. And he tells me to go stand at the hood of his squad car, which is parked almost directly behind my vehicle. And then he goes around, he pats down Addison, and Addison has a small container of weed in his breast pocket of his coat. So he just gives it up to the officer. We're trying to be as compliant as possible. And Addison is placed in handcuffs. So as Addison is sat down by where I'm standing, Officer Nixon radios for backup. And another squad car arrives on the scene, and Officer Murr and Officer Middleton join Nixon as he's just rummaging through my car, tearing it apart. We have had very little explanation of what's going on and why there's this additional vehicle. And mind you, we're about a block away from the District 6 police station. So not thinking anything of it, I put my arms out to the side as they're rummaging through my car, tearing it apart. And I asked them if I could just see a warrant before they continued to search my car. And this was a trigger for those officers. Immediately, Officer Murr and Officer Middleton turned around and started yelling, manufacturing this situation that didn't even exist. They were saying, "Stop resisting, don't come towards us, you don't do that," in very elevated tones, basically trying to highlight to anybody who would be looking at this situation to the point to where this person is doing something wrong. We need to apprehend this individual. when all I was trying to do was have a dialogue with them. And as they grabbed me and they twisted my arms into unusual positions, immediately causing pain, Officer Nixon turns around and says to me, "You don't have a license," as if this was his justification to then begin to hit me in the face. And he hit me with a closed fist repeatedly over and over and over again. And as he was hitting me, Officer Middleton, who was on my right arm, this is all transpiring between the bumpers of my car and Nixon's squad car, causes her to fall over the curb. The force of the impact from his punches causes Middleton to lose her balance, and as she's falling backwards, she tries to brace herself on my arm that she already has a hold of. And instead of bracing herself, what she did is she pulled us all down on top of her. And so now I'm laying sandwiched between Officer Middleton and these other two officers who are behind me, continuing to beat me with fists at first. And as I'm laying there immobilized, one arm is pinned between my chest and Tiffany Middleton's midsection, and my other arm is being held behind my back by Randy Murr as they're still delivering punches. I look up. This was the only mobility I had. As I looked up, and when I looked up towards Middleton, my gaze was met with the butt end of her radio. She had been able to remove her police radio and was now using it as a club to strike me in the lower part of my face, right here. And she struck me repeatedly. And I knew after the first couple of strikes that she had opened up my face. I could feel the blood, the warm blood, starting to flow down my cheek. I could see it starting to leak across the grass. I could feel it in my shirt, soaking into my clothing. And my eyes started to swell up. And almost immediately, it swelled all the way closed. And the next thing I remember is being grabbed around the neck in a chokehold style manner. And Officer Murr, who we later found out, yelled out, "He's reaching for her gun. He's reaching for her gun." And he broadcasted this over the radio. And again, mind you, the District 6 police station where these officers work is within stone's throw of this traffic stop. So it was literally like a mob mentality for additional officers. The majority of them ran over, didn't even bother to hop in their squad cars. They just ran over on foot, and the officers who did get in their squad cars used them to block Washington and 16th and 16th and Emerson to prevent traffic from flowing east or west or north or south. And then the next thing I know, I'm being hoisted backwards in a chokehold. And Officer Murr, what we found out in the statement, actually removed Tiffany Middleton's flashlight from her utility belt and started using this as a club to strike me repeatedly on the top of my head. I didn't know it was a flashlight at the time until we moved forward with the criminal proceedings, but I could feel the metallic object. I knew it wasn't a fist. I could tell that I had been hit with a very heavy object. And then the next thing I know, as multiple officers are swarming in to participate in this brutality, Addison is in the background yelling, "Stop! What the hell are you doing? Leave him alone." I'm thrown back to my face. And this time I land on the grass. Middleton is no longer underneath me. And when I hit the grass, I could see blood fly across the blades. And I knew that my injuries were bad, and this beating continued. And the next thing I hear is an officer yell out, "If he doesn't calm down, just shoot him." And Officer Nixon removed his service revolver from his holster, cocked it and put it to my temple. And I could feel the cold steel of the barrel, the pressure from the barrel pressed up against my head. And I could see his hand on the handle and his finger on the trigger, and I just closed my eyes. And I expected to be shot. And at that point, I lost consciousness, only to wake up to being rolled out of the gutter. They had maneuvered my body so I was face down in the gutter, literally face to face with my tires. And they rolled me out of the gutter, and they were dragging me backwards across the grass. Mind you, it's cold, so there's steam coming off of my blood-soaked clothing. And the officers are laughing. They're standing around laughing about what had just happened, as if it was business as usual for them. One officer told me I didn't know how close I was to getting my fucking head blown off. And another officer joked about the warrant that I asked for, and he said, "Where's that warrant now, you fucking nigger?" and they left me to bleed on a police jacket. And thankfully, somebody in that pool of officers had the wherewithal to call the paramedics. And maybe that was a blessing in disguise, because when the paramedics got there and when I was fading in and out of consciousness, they made contact with me, and initially I thought they were police. So my first response was, please don't hit me anymore. I honestly don't think I can take it. And then from there, they responded by saying, relax, we're with Denver Health, we're paramedics. And I said, why'd they beat me up? I didn't do anything wrong. And they had no answer. As first respondents to these types of scenes caused by police, they are very used to seeing the damage and impact law enforcement have when they are patrolling our communities with a negative agenda. And so the next thing that went through my mind was, I don't have insurance and I cannot pay for a trip to the hospital. I need you to leave. So I demanded that the paramedics pack up and take off. And they made an announcement. He doesn't want treatment. Let's get out of here. And I knew my injuries were bad. I couldn't see out of my right eye. I'm laying in a puddle of my own blood on the back of an officer's jacket. And I knew I needed some time. So as they were packing up, getting ready to go, I changed my mind and I told them, okay, you know what? Take me to the hospital. And had I not done that, I would be dead and I would not be here today. And I know that because as they loaded me onto the stretcher, at this point I am in their custody. So I'm being charged with criminal intent to disarm a peace officer as an effort for them to justify the amount of brutality that they decided to inflict. They handcuffed me to the stretcher at my wrists. They handcuffed me at my ankles. And then they loaded me in the back of an ambulance and they sent an accompanying officer with us to the hospital, which was only several blocks away. And I know that this was serious because as she's sitting there, the paramedics prepping gauze, they're getting the IVs and all of these things ready to treat my injuries. I tell them, no. Do not do anything until somebody takes pictures of these injuries as they are.
You know what, Alex? I have to stop you because when you tell me, I've heard you tell this story and I've read it about, I tell you, I've lost sleep over this story, pondering it. And it is mind blowing every time you tell it about you being in such a state. To me, it's like, from my perspective, because I look at things metaphysically, it's almost like your guardian angel was with you, because who would ever imagine of thinking, take pictures of the evidence? I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes and how I would be. I don't think that I would be in a state like that. I have to say that's brilliant. That is brilliant, because I don't think if you would have did that and they would have cleaned you up and things of this nature, the evidence would have been gone and it would maybe have turned out in a different type of way. That blows my mind every time you tell it.
Well, thank you. And honestly, that was the only rationalization for this irrational situation that occurred. The amount of injustice that I just had to endure was like, okay, the next thing that would make sense to me is to take pictures. And I have no idea where that came from. That was just the first bulb that popped into my head to address, was this will be very critical moving forward. It all happened so fast, and the level that they escalated it to obviously was totally unnecessary, but it was based on race and their personal bias. And the individual, a black male, myself, challenging their authority as police officers.
Wow, I was just, what the question I was going to ask you just sort of kind of flew out of my mind, because I'm still trying to rationalize the fact that you were brilliant enough at that time and conscious enough to take pictures. Well, this is the question I was going to ask you. What was the assumption that you made as an individual when they handcuffed Addison, they put him in the back of the car? What were you saying to yourself? What was the assumption that you made about the situation and what was going to happen to you?
So I honestly didn't even see them handcuffed, or I didn't see them take Addison away. At this point, by the time I was on the stretcher and in the back of the ambulance, I honestly had no idea where Addison was at. It made sense that they would probably want a statement from him because this all transpired right in front of him. And then meanwhile, I'm in the back of this ambulance and I'm demanding photos, and then I go into hemorrhagic shock and I start to seize very violently. My body gets very cold. All the hair stands up and I'm shaking on the stretcher as I'm handcuffed. And the paramedics told me, well, if we don't do something, you're not going to make it to the hospital. And so the paramedic put an oxygen mask over my mouth and nose and coached me through some breathing techniques. And that was enough to actually stabilize my vitals until we got to the hospital. But they didn't take pictures right away. They were hoping I was going to bleed out and die on the way to the hospital. It would have been the easiest way for them to cover this up. Meanwhile, Addison was actually taken to the police station and coerced into a false statement of events. And they threatened him with violence. They threatened him with jail time. They told him, if you do not write this how we tell you to write it, we will do the same thing we did to your friend. And we will charge you with the same things and we'll send you to jail. And that's what he did. He wrote it exactly how they told him to write it.
Well, I guess what I really meant to say was, if I was in a situation like that and I saw my friend, and it was still a little confrontational, if you will, but I would make the assumption that, they're going to be rational because, ironically, they're called, quote-unquote, peacemakers. They're taking my friend away. What I know, how ironic is that? Peacemakers. They're taking my friend away. They're talking. They're communicating with him. Okay, I'm not going to have. They see what the situation is. They're reading between the lines. However, it seems like two different stories sort of kind of happened with Addison and then with you. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, So seeing the way that they reacted to Addison. Any rational person would have said, okay, well, I'm not going to be harmed, if you will. And I'm basing this based on the information that the audience does not know, that we will talk about a little bit later. So I know that had to have been stunning when all of this parlayed and the snowball started to go downhill from there.
You're absolutely right. I mean, for Addison and even for myself at the time, we did not anticipate the fact that we are in danger, that we were just racially profiled, driving this vehicle as a black man with a white passenger at the hour we were driving in the neighborhood that we were driving through. And this was all still so surreal to Addison that taking him and manipulating his state of trauma through threats of violence and jail time was an easy way for them to coerce him into compliance, to cover up their actions. And they went much further than just coercion. I mean, they tried to manufacture bloody handprints on the back of a gun that didn't exist, and they got corroborative testimony from officers who hadn't even been dispatched from the station yet, and they tried to throw one of their fellow colleagues under the bus, and later it fell apart. The officer who I allegedly tried to disarm came forward and said, I was never assaulted by Mr. Landau, and he never went for or touched my firearm. And their stories were so conflicting, they couldn't even be represented by the same defense attorneys in a court of law. And all of this for Addison and for myself growing up with the reinforcement of narratives coming from an all-white family was that police officers are there to serve and protect. We can trust police. Police are the go-to when crime occurs, not knowing or having the influence or wherewithal to think that actually police can commit crimes, and they have impunity offered to them around those crimes by the district attorney because they know the DAs will not prosecute them for such actions.
One of the things that blew my mind as well about your case, and we talked in depth about this, the fact that there was a woman there. There were just certain elements about this story that blew my mind. I meditated on it. I'm just like, wow. And why is that? Because, and I'm looking at this from a spiritual perspective again as well. A woman, we are life bringers. We bring life into this world, whether that's nurturing other people, mothering, or being a mother. So the fact that a woman would participate in such beastly activity and be okay with that blew my mind. And, I have to do some more investigation in reference to other cases, but to me, I thought that was very unique, and it really stuck out like a sore thumb. And it was mind blowing. We are usually the mediators of peace and the mediators of, helping things settle down. Not in all cases, because, women wild out as well. You know what I'm saying? But I just found that so fascinating that a person in that role, a woman, would be able to parlay in activities like this and be okay. It just, I don't know why it just sticks to my spirit like that. It's mind-blowing for me.
Well, and you know what's interesting? The female officer was the officer they tried to
throw under the bus.
Exactly. They were all white officers, and then they were all males except for her. So to be viewed as we don't want to be the officers who we are going to falsely charge this individual with attempting to disarm, because we're men, we're macho, we're the individuals who can hold our own. But it's easier to use the only female officer on the scene, who just so happened to lose her footing and fall over the curb, as the easy way out, as the incompetent individual who has no control of her firearm around this dangerous black male who we have to beat into submission in order to subdue.
And another thing that it made me realize too, Alex, is the institutional ideologies that permeate in that groupings, meaning the police, how powerful it is. It goes across gender, it goes across race. And I was like, wow. That's what made me realize that the indoctrination of having to be a certain way and parlay a certain way is very much powerful. And that if you go against the grain of that, just within that dynamic can be a problem for that individual within that institution. So when I was reading your story and they talk about the woman, it just made me also realize how powerful that indoctrination is, and that those rules are, and that if you don't participate in that, there is consequence. I would imagine from her end, she got tons of consequence for her behavior with you, and just a lot of things. It just made me realize a lot of things. I thought it was very fascinating in nature.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one thing we have to understand is there's an indoctrination that occurs. This ideology of a blue line or a code of silence, or we protect our own, that is very real. And officers who go against that are really jeopardizing their own safety. And you will see all types of retaliation, from promotions to pay increases, all the way to potentially jeopardizing your life and family or your own safety. And this is something that law enforcement, not only in Denver, but across the country, have demonstrated that it is us versus them. And when one of us gets into a situation, we expect you to have our back. Regardless of the circumstances, you do what you have to do, and you do what it takes to support your fellow officer. And that is something that we as a community are very familiar with in the Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor sectors. And it's finally surfacing now as a reality, but really this reality has been in existence since law enforcement practices began.
God, there's so many things I want to say. My mind is running. But however, we're now in the ambulance. This is parlayed. You have the oxygen mask, and you're thinking all of these things. What happens from there, Alex, on the way to the hospital?
So initially, the paramedics in the ambulance wanted to provide me with an IV. And I told them, no, I don't want any needles. Just the oxygen mask is fine. I'd prefer to not have a needle in my arm. And the officer who was accompanying me said, oh, he can take a beating, but he's scared of needles. What a pussy. Just adding insult to injury and reiterating the mentality of the individuals who were involved in this assault, the District 6 officers. And then when we finally get to Denver Health, they wheel me through the emergency room entrance. And there's an entourage of police already waiting for us to get there. And there are it's riddled with patrons, other community members who are there for various reasons, just sitting in the lobby. And the next thing I started to do was to yell, "This is how Denver police treats black people. This is what can happen to black youth in these streets after midnight." And all the police in the room circled my stretcher, and they told folk with their backs towards me, and they told everyone in the waiting room, "Do not get involved. Do not say anything or approach us, or we will charge you for interference." And then the next thing you know, they wheel me into this back room, and they tried to get statements out of me twice prior to taking these photos. And each time I spoke with them, I was like, "I have nothing to say to you. Where are my pictures? I want someone to take pictures of this." And it became very clear in hindsight that I was not going to die, and that now the doctor was liable, because I could not be transported to the detention center, the Denver City Jail, until I was treated for the lacerations in my face and whatever other damages may have occurred. And so finally, because had they just transferred me and I died in jail because of these open wounds, or I got a serious infection, the doctor would be responsible for that. So eventually someone came in to take pictures, and I'm surprised these pictures were developed and included in the discovery. But then the doctor stitched me up. It took 45 stitches to close up my face. And then he gave me a CAT scan, said I had a concussion and a broken nose. And there was no special transportation to the jail. They actually loaded me in the back of a paddy wagon with several other people in this dark van that's got these plastic seats and it's full of cages. It's like, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a paddy wagon to the fullest, and everybody who's sitting in there is handcuffed. The seats are low, so you're intentionally sitting in an uncomfortable position, and they drove us all to the jail. And when we got to the jail, the first thing I remember is being unloaded underground. And the people who they transported with us saw my face and they were like, "The police did that to you, didn't they?" And I was like, yeah, they did. And then they took us through booking. And they put me in an isolated unit for quite some time, a couple of hours, monitoring my vitals. I was by myself in this holding cell, totally being desensitized. They would check my vitals every so often. And then they finally booked me through and they processed me to the felony floor. I believe it was the second floor of the facility. And everybody in that pod, or on that floor, there were several different pods, were being charged with felony crimes. And as soon as I was being booked through the deputies, the sheriffs in Denver, there's one sheriff, and everybody who's underneath that sheriff is a deputy. And the deputies staff the jails and they staff the courtrooms, and this is their jurisdiction. They actually could not follow you up the street and then turn on their lights and pull you over. That is way outside of their scope of work as deputies. So we're in the jail, and the deputies know full well that the police had done this to me. They asked me about it, and they knew full well that these injuries were caused by law enforcement. And I'm sitting and I'm making my call. I'm trying to reach out to folks who I know, what phone numbers I have memorized, trying to contact my parents, friends, my roommate, to let anybody who I could get in touch with know where I'm at and to relay information to my parents. And every single time I got to a phone, I used one in the isolated individual pod before they booked me up to the floor. Couldn't get through to anybody. Nobody's phones were accepting collect calls from the Department of Corrections. And that was the same when I reached the felony floor. And they put me in a cell, a two-man cell, with another individual who had this horrible scar on his rib cage from when Denver police sicked a dog on him while he was in handcuffs, and then just let the dog chew on him for a little while before they finally took him into custody. And mind you, this light is on in our cell 24 hours a day. We had no window in this particular cell. And I have this black and white mugshot where I had blood leaking through my stitches as the only reference to how bad my injuries were. I hadn't even seen my face. I never got a chance to look in a mirror. And this is stale, dry air that we're breathing in. And mind you, the only thing that I had to use as a pillow was my blood-soaked T-shirt. So our entire cell just stank of the aroma of my own blood. And it was repugnant. It was overwhelming. And, you know, it would be enough to make one nauseous. And every couple of hours, they would take me out and check my vitals. That first night there, my cellmate he was a diabetic. He still is a diabetic, I'm sure. And he tried to get the attention of the deputies who were doing rounds every few hours. He tried to tell the deputy that his blood sugar was low. And the deputy said, breakfast is in 8 hours. Wait to go see the nurse when we take you down for breakfast. And an hour later, he collapsed on the floor. And had I not been his cellmate, had he been assigned to a one-man cell, he probably would have died, because I had to jump off the bunk and I had to bang on the door until a deputy came up to figure out why I was banging on this cell door. And I told him, my cellmate collapsed several minutes ago. I believe he is having some issues with his diabetes. He needs to go see the nurse. So two deputies came in and they drug him downstairs to see the nurse. And he ended up being okay, but just the negligence and the dehumanization of being confined or a jailed person that these individuals give you and treat you so subhuman. And these are the individuals who are supposed to be responsible for your care while you're in their custody. And so at this point, nobody even knows where I'm at. And finally, after checking my vitals every couple of hours, and they did this for a couple of days, I finally communicate. I developed a bit of a relationship with one of the deputies at the desk. We would talk every time I would go down there. And I told her, you know, my parents don't even know that I'm here. You know, nobody that is close to me has any idea where I'm at. And the individual who saw me get beat up has no idea if I'm even alive. And so I gave her my mom's phone number. I convinced her to make a phone call to my mom when she had an opportunity to do so. And going directly against policy, she did that in one of her off periods. She left my mom a brief message saying, I'm a deputy at the Denver City Jail. Your son is down here. You need to come see him immediately. My mom was substituting for DPS at the time when she got this call. And so some time goes by, and actually a detective came to visit me while I was in jail and tried to get another statement out of me. And I refused to talk to him. I told him I needed to speak to an attorney before I spoke to anyone else, somebody who had my best interest at heart. And at this point, I'm totally desensitized. The lights are on. I've survived this brutal incident. I'm being charged with a felony crime. I'm in jail. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to navigate this. So, like, in a fight for flight sort of response, I just desensitized. And it wasn't until I found out I had a visitor. My mom came to visit me while I was there. And deputies come in, Mr. Landau, you have a visitor. So I'm like, okay. They chain me up. They handcuff my wrists. They shackle me around the waist. They wrap a chain down to my ankles. They cuff my ankles. And then they have this lockbox that they use to attach my cuffs to my midsection. And then they put me on this rickety elevator with peeling green paint. And they bring us down to this main floor. They walk me through this dimly lit hallway that's being surveillanced from all angles. And this door slides open, and they put me in there. One deputy follows me and takes all my chains off. And then that door slams shut, and another door opens up. And I walk out, and I see my mom on the other side of this incredibly thick bulletproof glass. And the first thing that came to my mind was to smile. Like I was glad to see a familiar face. And her response was horror. She just became ecstatic. She started to scream. She started to yell. She grabbed this woman next to her, turned her around and says, look what they did to my son. She didn't even know this woman. Yeah. And I started to cry. She started to cry. I started to cry. And it was the first time I had felt anything since this happened. It wasn't the pain from the injuries. It wasn't the burden of being charged with a felony crime or anything. It was seeing how it impacted my mom that really hit me. And then I had to immediately set those emotions aside because I had about 1 minute and 30 seconds to relay critical information, who to talk to, who not to talk to, tell dad how much my bail is. This is where money is at so you can bail me out. We need to seek an attorney. Make sure if anyone calls you, you don't say anything until we have our own defense attorney. And then boom, back to your cell. and I didn't know when the next time I was going to be able to see her was going to be, or if she was coherent enough after seeing my injuries to digest that information, let alone relay it to someone else. So that was really the hardest part of that experience up until that point for me, was being brought back down to reality and seeing how this impacted my family, and then being drugged immediately away from that and forced back upstairs. And it's interesting because as a day or so went by, while we were there, my cell flooded. And we got back from court one morning, and there was like ankle-high water because of a pipe that had burst from the ceiling. So they had to transfer my cellmate and I to an alternative pod nearby. And then the following day, my dad came. He had posted bail. He bailed me out, and we went immediately to internal affairs, which is it's on the same block. It was like walking out one door and into another. And we're talking to this intake agent. Her name's Virginia Quinones. And at first she was very empathetic towards my father. She's like, this is terrible. We hear you. And then the moment I get in there, the first thing she does, mind you, this is IAB, the entity where you're supposed to be able to report a case of misconduct from uniformed personnel. The first thing she does is she turns on a tape recorder and says, if any of this is false or manufactured or you're lying, we will charge you with perjury and we will prosecute you to the full extent of the law. As if the bruised face and the visible 45 stitches, my age and my charges wasn't enough. Now you are potentially liable for any false information you give in this interview. So as I'm telling her my narrative, I get to the point to where they call me a nigger, and she freezes the conversation. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sometimes you need to own up to your actions as a man, and it's not always a good idea to play the rape card. And then she went off on this side tangent talking about how if you would have tried to disarm me, I would have killed you. And I'm sitting here just in shock, like, this is internal affairs. And so I shut the conversation down. I've listened to the recording, and I'm like, I can't trust you. This conversation is over. This conversation is over. And my complaint was so mishandled, we had to come back down the road after I got civil representation and do a brand new complaint. And a year later, we found out internal affairs was staffed by officers who were under investigation for misconduct already. So what kind of a deterrent is that,
Ooh, let me take a drink of coffee. Wait a minute. I know the chica that was interviewing you, she was Latina, right?
Yes.
That's very interesting. Wow, we could go into a whole conversation about that one within itself, the indoctrination of people of color against their own people, but that's a whole nother series. What was it? Good God, man, when you said that, I was like, wait a minute, did I hear that right? Wow. What was going on behind the scenes with Addison? So your father and you are trying to do this claim with internal affairs. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, your parents didn't hear anything from Addison. You didn't hear anything from Addison. What's happening with Addison on his side of the fence?
I think he's going through this process of digestion himself, it's totally compromised everything he's ever thought about law enforcement. He's been traumatized. Meanwhile, I'm going through this criminal case, and we need him to give an affidavit. Eventually we're like, Addison, you know full well this is not what happened. You need to tell them what really happened. And so when he started to come back with an affidavit, immediately the prosecution was like, well, you're an unreliable witness. We can't trust you. Your testimony is not valuable in a court of law because you have gone total 180. So when he started to tell the truth about his coercion and about how he was pressured into this statement by police, they tried to throw it out entirely. And meanwhile, Officer Nixon is going back and forth with this detective, talking about how the detective sent him an email saying he wanted to know more about the criminal intent to disarm a peace officer. And Ricky Nixon responds, well, when we got back to the station, I observed Officer Middleton wiping what appeared to be a bloody handprint off the backstrap of her gun. I don't know if this helps. End email. And you would think in a case, again, throwing the only woman officer on the scene under the bus, in a case where criminal intent to disarm a peace officer is the charge, you don't destroy the bloody handprint. That is the key piece of evidence that sends me to prison. And you're telling me that she just washed it off the backstrap of her gun? No, because it never existed. There was never a bloody handprint on the backstrap of her gun. And these were efforts they were taking to manufacture not only evidence, but they gathered testimony from officers who hadn't been dispatched, saying that they saw my hand on her gun and I was trying to remove her service revolver before they had even left the station. So this is what they were doing behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Addison and I we had school we needed to go to. I got out of jail and I went to school the following week with 45 visible stitches in my face. And I just had to jump right back into life and keep things rolling. I had work I had to go to. I was behind on bills, my classes I had to take care of. So, it was really like, okay, well, yeah, this is terrible, but it's just another brick in the wall. And it's just another component for the knapsack that you have to carry because life has to go on and you have to be proactive in all of the other arenas you were already involved in. So that's exactly what we did. And, it was very difficult for him. He hated talking about the entire situation. It was very overwhelming for him for probably a number of reasons. And he was getting pressure from all angles around his testimony because he was the only visible witness. And there were no other witnesses that we saw because we combed through the neighborhood and no one saw anything from what they told us. And there was a lot of stress and pressure on his shoulders as an individual, and mine as well, obviously. But for him, I think this was something that he thought he would never have to confront in his lifetime, and to an extent probably thought didn't go on anymore in these types of communities, that we were in a post-racial society and that police didn't treat people of color this way anymore, let alone himself. And it's interesting that he was charged with a possession of marijuana, given a ticket and released and let go. And I was beaten almost to death for trying to have a conversation with law enforcement on the scene and then falsely charged with a felony crime.
What happened to Addison and what's going on with Addison now? Because I know that we have talked in depth about this, and the road that you're taking is very much different than the road that Addison is taking. And I do have to say that, and this is a reality, anybody who watches the H20 network knows I keep it real still, and some people ain't gonna like what I'm gonna say, but it's the truth. This is the truth, Ruth. When you're, and this is not with everyone, but white privilege, when you're Caucasian, and you're just living your life and doing your thing, you may not know that it exists, but there's white privilege there. Economically, you are the hegemony, even though you may not be there as an individual. From this perspective, you are. So there's an individual essence of privilege that is there. So when you're confronted with reality like that, it can be startling, and it can take your consciousness to a completely different place and really take you over the edge. And that seems to be the case with Addison. Am I not correct?
No, you're absolutely right. So he spiraled into substance abuse and began to work through his own traumas that way. And, moving forward with my criminal case, it was dismissed a week before trial. And he was thankful. He's like, oh, great, this is over, right? We'll be able to move on with life. And as the two of us, we slowly started to grow further and further apart. And I think a lot of that had to do with this developing addiction or addictions that were kind of going on behind the scenes. And I'm sitting there. I printed off a list of civil attorneys after a conversation with one of my former teachers. And I had already been denied by a handful of attorneys saying I didn't have a case. And there was a point where I was just grateful to be alive, and I remember having conversations with him about, well, the case was dismissed. You're able-bodied. You're in school, just trying to count blessings because I had been deterred in so many outlets from being able to pursue a civil case against these officers. And then I was sitting in the South classroom of CCD on Auraria campus, and one of my teachers walked up, Yvonne Fry, and this was the last thing she said to me. She said, "Alex, don't give up on justice. You deserve enough money to come back and buy this campus." And she said that to me on a Tuesday, and she was hit by a drunk driver over the weekend and killed on 14th and Colorado Boulevard. And that was all I needed to hear. I went in and printed out this list and just called and crossed them out. I spoke to over 30 different firms before I finally found a firm who would take my case. And when I finally did, I told Addison, I was like, this is actually going to move in a whole nother direction now. We're still going to need you to participate. So meanwhile, this burden, when he thought it was unloaded, was now back on his shoulders full-fledged, because shortly after that, the FBI got involved. And then he was being contacted by U.S. Marshals. The Department of Justice got involved. And within 6 months, 2 of those same officers had gone on to assault other members of the community in 2 separate cases that were caught on video. And this was starting to blow up in this trifecta. And this was something he wanted nothing to do with from the moment it happened. So this, again, just turning him to avenues to numb his emotions and his emotional attachment to the situation was very difficult for him. And he had to circle back around with his family and let them know how bad his addictions had actually gotten, and had to seek substance abuse treatment. And he did that in Texas, far away from the folks he had developed relationships with here in Denver. This was after the civil case had been settled. And that was just too much for him. So this really spiraled him into a life of substance abuse that, from the Addison that I knew, would not have occurred if he did not witness such a traumatic experience transpire right before his eyes.
I don't want to take it there, but I find it fascinating that, of course, there's 6 billion people on the planet and we're all different. But the road that Addison took of denial, of cognitive dissonance, and then you're a human rights activist, that's a completely different turn. Wow. Why do you think that is? I mean, for the obvious reasons. We are all individual consciousnesses, and we can all take certain things and we can't, but it's one extreme to the other. Why do you think that there are 2 extremes like that?
It's difficult to really say. I think a lot of people will not know how they will respond until they're put into a situation to actually have to do so. And for me, seeing the way that these officers continue to brutalize other people who were actually charged with, in one case, they charged one of the women with the exact same charge they charged me with, criminal intent to disarm a peace officer. And we started to see this pattern. It just started to resonate with me as like a need to speak out and elevate the voice of people who have historically not had a voice in this realm, on this platform, as a way to elevate those who have continuously been oppressed by these types of injustices with no recognition from the facade of our criminal justice system, let alone offered any services to themselves as survivors or their families as victims / survivors of these experiences. So it was just like a human nature that overcame me, that we as a people are suffering, and the people who are inflicting this suffrage are law enforcement, our criminal justice system, are folks who are in roles of power, who are developing laws that further oppress us, or just turning a blind eye to our suffrage completely. And I think for me, that's always been a character that I've had to some degree, is a big heart, the need to look out for my fellow humans, the fellows who are in my circle, And I think everybody is a little bit different. But when this experience happened for me, it was a milestone and kind of a catalyst into a broader range of thinking about injustices. And then being a survivor and then seeing people gunned down, seeing people go through these same types of brutal interactions and not surviving, there was a bit of an obligation that I kind of felt to really take this on. And for me, it was also, it seemed like a positive way to channel my rage and frustration and my built up emotions against the individuals who did this to me and the criminal justice system that allowed this to happen. So for me, it was more of like a therapeutic channel in a sense. Like there could have been a million other ways I could have decided to handle this. But this was the avenue that felt most appropriate and most relieving. At this point in time, I was doing a bunch of writing at the same time around my experiences around in poetic forms, and that was comforting for me. And then to be able to talk about this narrative over and over again, yes, I relived trauma, and I continue to when I discuss it, but there's also a form of relief that comes with that as well, because you come to a deeper understanding of how this happened, why this happened, and in this case, this is not my fault that this happened. And it is actually a much larger structural complex that is occurring across the globe in our communities. And that's part of the reason why when that switch was flipped, there was really no way to undo that. And this way of thinking is just now the way of thinking that can only be expanded. It cannot be reversed. So it just seemed like the healthy way to channel this energy.
Well, it's deep to me because I look at the symbology. I guess that's my media self, studying media and just the symbology of things. The symbology of Addison in his way and then your way, and then the collective of what has happened. Look at what we're going through right now. We have cognitive dissonance in the greater essence of humanity, Addison. We have people who are standing up and seeing the truth and not waiting until the train actually hits them, Alexander. You understand what I'm saying? And then you have the collective of like the police and all the brutality that they embarked upon you both, which is the essence of humanity and what we're going through right now. So it's sort of the symbology in that is just very, very profound to me, because we have no choice. We've ignored this conversation about race for so long and the things that we deem to be invisible but still exist, and we have to talk about them, and we have to do it in a productive way. So the dynamics of that is just very interesting to me, just reading your story and reading more into the situation and what parlayed.
Yes, no, and I think even for me, like, the more that I comb through my own narrative in this experience, it seems like I can always pull something out of it that I may not have recognized before. I can always connect the dot from that experience to somebody else's oppression. And this is really what I started to do throughout the work, and it became very intersectional, and it became very symbolic to me that this is the culture, this is how the United States was incubated, was on experiences like this and oppression like this. And it's very easy for people to say, oh, I don't have to worry about it because it doesn't impact me directly. And that's really where they're wrong. And that's really where they're perpetuating this narrative of not only injustice, but disenfranchisement and cultural distances that we have seen time and time again. And the best thing for them to do is to not acknowledge it, because it's hard, it's difficult, it's painful, and we don't want that in our day-to-day routine. But for some people, that is just not a choice. We are targets the moment we wake up in the morning, and even when we're asleep, the moment we step outside, we see houses being raided on false information that result in a no-knock raid, and then individuals inside the home who had nothing to do with the instance that the law enforcement individuals came to that residence for, they weren't involved with that, and they end up injured. So, I mean, this has always been a hypersensitive image, and for our normative society. When they see folks of color, there are ideologies that are automatically implemented and ways of thinking, whether you're aware of them or not. And this is part of the problem. And when we see folks who can easily say, oh, this doesn't impact me, they are confused and misinformed, and they don't understand how they're contributing to marginalization, I would say.
I completely concur. What happened to the cops that were involved in this case, Alex?
Oh, wow. So the police involved, like I said, within 6 months had gone on to assault other members of the community. Two of the officers in high-profile cases that we know of. Who knows what the other? So there were 11 officers who responded, and who knows what those other 9 officers have been engaging in. But 2 of those officers were caught on video harming other members of the community. And in my particular case, they were never prosecuted, and nor were they prosecuted for any other actions they engaged in outside of my case. And then we have in Denver this process of policy assessment and procedural evaluations called the discipline matrix. And what that is a review of whether or not a policing policy or procedure was violated. And the best thing that can come out of that would be termination, or the most substantial discipline you could see out of that would be termination. You could get demoted, you could get suspended, all of these other things can happen as well. But the manager of safety at the time, Alex Martinez, spent over 4 years assessing whether or not the officers in my case deserved to be disciplined. Mind you, again, the maximum discipline they could receive would be termination. This is long after the DA decided not to file charges, said no criminal charges or no criminal accusations had taken place. And so we did an action on a Tuesday. This is some 4.5 years into this investigation. We did an action on a Tuesday, publicly humiliating him around the amount of time he had taken to review and come to a conclusion on my case. And then he came out with a decision that Friday saying that the officers had done nothing wrong and they weren't going to be disciplined at all. And then he resigned 2 weeks later from his post. And I really think that was a personal vendetta that he had with me because of the way we publicly shamed his position as a manager of safety, and the way he perpetuated these violence and really strung my case out 4.5 years with no repercussions to the officers involved. And actually, the cases that happened after mine, we followed those all the way to conclusion as well. And they moved a lot faster than my case did. And 2 of the officers were successfully terminated in that process. But part of the issue with the discipline matrix is they have police unions, the PPA in Denver, the Police Protective Association, and all over the country they have unions who represent their officers. In Denver, there is no limit to the amount of appeals that the matrix on behalf of the Police Protective Association can give any particular discipline from a superior. So if the manager of safety decides to fire an officer, they can appeal it. And then that just kicks it into this whole, it's like an infinite abyss of just review and agreement or disagreement and either appeal or denial. And so essentially, but the most important part to take away from this is there are still officers from these cases that took place over 7 years ago pending in this limbo who are still working through their appeals process up to the Colorado Supreme Court. And if they are successful in appealing and they get reinstated to being police officers, we as taxpayers owe them 7.5 years of back pay for the time that they've been on administrative leave. And that's really what we started doing, was following cases all the way through this overwhelming matrix that's completely set up to favor law enforcement from start to finish. And we have successfully seen 2 of these officers fired. For my case.
Wow. It seems to me that things are on an increase, Alex, all over the country. People of color have known that this has been going on forever, but now it's becoming more public in the public matrix of media. What do you think, what is going on? Why does this seem to be a normalization within our society? I'm not into this. It seems like there was one point in time that I was keeping track of my RSS feed, and it seemed like every day for like 2 weeks someone was getting killed or getting taken out by the police or something. What is going on with this energy? Why do we keep repeating these cycles?
Well, the easiest way that I can wrap my mind around it is that the United States is functioning off of a business model. Nothing succeeds like success. Change is financially risky, so we repackage and we redistribute. And that's exactly what has been happening for generations, hundreds of years. I mean, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, they were doing convict leasing in Alabama. And that would mean that the most well-built individual who was black and who had the longest stay in the prison was worth the most to any particular corporation. And they would lease us out, and they would have us do physical labor. That practice is still happening now in our penitentiaries. And the way police our communities, it's not that the violence has become more rampant on behalf of law enforcement. It's just that, we didn't have cameras at our disposal like we do now. And I do believe that folks are coming to a point of consciousness, black, white, Latino, indigenous, folks across the board are starting to recognize that these practices are saturating our environments. And it's very distinct. It's distinct when law enforcement develops the idea that blue lives matter as a way to combat Black Lives Matter, because really what they're saying is exactly what we've been talking about, this code of silence, this us versus them, this brotherhood. If you are wearing a uniform, you're one of us, and we are blue. But blue is not an ethnicity. It's not really even a culture. It's a practice that has been put into play. Black is black. Latino is Latino. However you choose to identify is how you choose to identify. And you take that uniform off at the end of the day. But what that really says to me is that, no, we are practicing these practices because this is the way that it's supposed to be. And these are poisons that have riddled our communities. And I think a lot of what we've seen, the tensions, of course, are increasing because people are not going to be subservient. People are making conscious decisions to combat these types of oppressions in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's organized, sometimes it's strategic, sometimes it's irrational. I mean, across the board. But even when you see police being killed or you see police being hurt by rogue individuals, they are victims of police brutality. Because if you back a cat into a corner, or you back a group of cats into a corner long enough, and you just throw rocks at them, eventually something is going to happen. You are going to see an eruption. You will see claws. And that is exactly what they have tried to do to our communities for hundreds of years. They have tried to keep us subservient in these corners and under some sort of thumb of obedience for far too long, in completely unjust fashions. And part of the way they maintain power is through acts of violence. And people are fed up with that. And those officers who get hurt or who get killed, rest in peace. But that is a direct correlation to the lack of response on behalf of the justice system to hold dangerous officers and uniformed personnel accountable.
Cause and effect. And I do have to throw this out before I let you go, because we'll be doing a powwow all night if it was up to me.
I know.
You know how we do. Now, this crazy election, we are now percolating in the craziness for a long time. However, this thing here that is about to happen in November is going to change the game a little bit. It's really going to change the game. And I'll keep my opinions to myself. However, what is your opinion on that? And you know who I'm referring to when I say that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really, one thing we have to understand is that what this has done is made people feel comfortable about voicing their personal biases that have always been there. They're not recruiting new racists or new bigots. These are people who are in our communities who have always felt this way, and this is a teaching that has been passed down to them for whatever reason, and they feel safe space to be able to express themselves in this way. I mean, this is definitely triggering hostilities between, or not even, they're not even horizontal, they are vertical, because the majority of these people who are exercising these stereotypical ideologies around folks of color and their own personal biases are already on the elevated platform of white privilege. And so there isn't a horizontal hostility because we're not on the same level. They are above us, so we are looking up to them, and it's a vertical hostility. But this is scary, and it's very terrifying because we have seen time and time again on local levels these types of practices accepted by administrative figures, DAs, mayors, presidents. And Obama has made steps to acknowledge the disparities in our communities, maybe not as substantive as folks would like to see. But however, should we get someone like Trump in the White House, talk about a green light for folks to commit race-based hatred and racially motivated violence with no repercussion. We've seen that demonstrated at his rallies. We have seen him support that type of behavior. And we have seen time and time again the demonstration that Black, Brown, Indigenous, or just folks of color or supporters of folks of color, their lives are worth less in the general scheme of things. And the fact that the slogan is, "I will make America great again," there hasn't been a period in history where the United States, North America, has been good for people of color. So I'm not really sure what he's referring to other than the amplifying of white privilege and potential immunity for the average common Anglo individual to commit violence against folks of color. And at the end of the day, it's ignorance, and it's a global joke that the United States would even allow an individual to make it this far down the campaign trail without somebody saying, "You are not a credible individual. You do not have the benefits of people, humanity in mind." And that should be something taken seriously. I mean, as people of color, or as anybody, as a human in general, you should understand when you can read rhetoric or you can see the same damaging impacts just through language. Like, if this man was elected, talk about eliminating tough on crime rhetoric. That is part of what we're trying to do. This would reinstall everything that we have worked to dismantle tenfold, I would say. And there would be serious problems for folks around the world who are already in conditions of suffrage.
It's very profound that he's gotten this far, and it reflects a lot on American society. And people will not admit that, but if you're really truthful with oneself, if you're really honest with yourself, the fact that maniac, yeah, I said it, narcissistic maniac has gotten this far is a reflection on the psychology of American society. And if people are not seeing that, that's a problem. And we need to be concerned about that, because he could literally flip and change over so many things that people have fought for, from religion to race to gender. I mean, the list goes on. He could literally, start World War III, 4, 5, and 6. And that's not an understatement. It is not an understatement. He's a narcissistic to the max. And the fact that numbers of people have allowed this individual to push forward is a mind blower to me. I just don't understand it. But yet, oh, we're the land of the free, we're the land of, I do not understand it. So the whole game of where we're at right now is craziness. But if someone like that is sitting in the Oval Office, we're really going to have problems. And we really need to have intelligent, percolating conversations, because it's going to get real deep for a lot of people that think they're immune. Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting ride, Alexander. That's all I can say. It's gonna be an interesting ride. But I thank you, Alex. I thank you for hanging out with me this evening. What are we talking about in the next video? Because yes, we do have 4 more after this, and this is like a little powwow. So what are we putting out there to the people to think about and to percolate on? And family, make sure that you email us through Facebook and all of our little outlets, and send us questions so we can have these discussions. And we're going to bring some people in later on after we do me and Alex do our powwow. But what are you thinking about for next show?
Well, so a lot of things resonated with me after this dialogue. A lot of things came up. One thing that listeners don't even know, and well, maybe they do, maybe they picked on it because I hinted to it a little bit. I'm adopted, and both of my parents were white. So I'd like to discuss how that played a role to my perception of this country and the way that I would be treated as a black man and those experiences. And also, just to add this little caveat, on my dad's side of the family, both my grandfather and my great-grandfather were Denver police officers.
Oh, my God.
So, and I also think, the idea of race and racism versus prejudice and what that really means, I think, is something we need to hash out. What is racism? Can folks of color be racist? Or what does that even look like? Other things I think that we should discuss that came to mind are, who are the primary actors in this idea of a criminal justice system? Who are the perpetuating forces? And who perpetuates the culture of violence amongst law enforcement, over policing, over incarceration, over supervision, over prosecution? I think there are plenty of things for us to hash out in those segments. And I know that I had my mind was overflowing. I had a list of things I wanted to discuss. I'm going to have to revisit it. But those are the immediate things that came to mind. Definitely, I would say.
Well, we're going to be riding this train. We're going to be deep sea diving, as we always do on the H20 network. My listeners know, once you get on the air with me and we're getting down in the town, I'm telling you, it's going to be a long ride, because I like to go deep. And, as we talked about, and a lot of people have mundane conversations, and that is all needed in reference to this topic. But we got to get to the seed. If we really want to see how we're going to create a new way, look at things from a different perspective, we have to go deep down in the earth and pick that seed out. Not just clip the hedges. We got to go deep down, and we're not clipping no hedges. We're going deep down and we're digging that seed out. So I'm just excited about this journey that we're about to take. It's going to be a very, very profound one. And again, I thank you for hanging out with me. I thank you for sitting here and talking to the listeners. I know they are going to really enjoy this recording, and I'm glad that you told your story. We didn't tell all of it because, man, I tell you, that's like a series within itself. But I wanted people to get a taste of why you are the activist that you are, why you do what you do, what you see, the man. That's important to me, how that's affected you. And we'll get deeper into that as we get the behind story of your life and who you are. To me, that's very much important. Not just the incident. There's more to the man and more to the story. And thank God you're still here. I always say sometimes there are things that happen to us in life, but it's a synchronicity to a greater thing. You have so much to give to humanity. And I'm so glad that you were able to share it with me tonight. Thank you, Alex.
Blessings. Thank you.
And until next time, family. Bye-bye.